There's a strange kind of truth that only reveals itself when you stop trying to find it, not because it was hidden, not because it wanted to remain unseen, but because some things refuse to appear while they're being chased. They wait, quietly, pot-shitly, until the moment you become still enough to notice them. That's how this began. Not with a conversation, not with a moment that could be pointed to and labeled as important. There was no clear beginning, no obvious shift, no event significant enough to explain why your presence started occupying space inside my mind, and maybe that's why it stayed with me. Because everything meaningful in my life has always announced itself. Every lesson, every loss, every person who left a mark, there was always a moment where I could say, there, that's when it happened. But with you, I can't do that. I can trace the pattern. I can revisit the details. I can examine every interaction from every angle. And still, I can't find the exact point where awareness became attachment to understanding, or where understanding became something deeper than recognition. All I know is that one day you were simply another presence among many, and then somehow you weren't. The difference wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, almost invisible. The kind of change that happens beneath the surface long before it reaches conscious thought. I started noticing your absence before I noticed your importance. And that realization alone should have told me everything. Because absence only has weight when something already occupies space. And somehow, without permission, without announcement, without effort, you had begun occupying space, not in my life, in my awareness. There's a difference. People enter lives all the time. They participate in routines. They become part of schedules. They create memories. Then eventually they leave. But awareness is different. Awareness doesn't rely on proximity. It doesn't require interaction. It doesn't need consistency. Once something enters awareness deeply enough, distance becomes irrelevant. And that's what unsettled me. The fact that your presence remained intact even when there was nothing actively reinforcing it, no constant communication, no repeated reassurance, no deliberate effort. Yet somehow the understanding remained steady, unchanged, almost as if it existed independently of circumstance. I tried to explain it away. At first, I assumed familiarity, then coincidence, then pattern recognition. I explored every explanation that allowed me to keep this inside the boundaries of logic. But every explanation eventually collapsed under its own weight, because none of them accounted for the precision. The way you seemed to understand things before they became visible. The way certain silences felt less like absence and more like communication. The way I could sense your perspective without hearing it, not because I imagined it, but because I'd already learned how you saw things, not through information, through structure. That word keeps returning, structure, because people often confuse connection with emotion. They think depth comes from feelings, from intensity, from vulnerability. But that's not always true. Sometimes depth comes from architecture, from discovering another mind built with similar foundations, not identical, just compatible in ways that matter. And compatibility at that level changes everything, because suddenly understanding stops being effort. It becomes instinct. You stop translating yourself. You stop adjusting your thoughts into something easier to receive. You stop preparing explanations before speaking. And for someone like me, that's rare, dangerously rare. Because I've spent most of my life translating, converting complexity into something digestible, reducing depth into manageable pieces. Not because people are incapable, but because clarity requires adaptation. Most conversations are acts of interpretation. Most relationships are built on approximation. People don't fully understand each other. They simply understand enough. Enough to function, enough to connect, enough to continue. But with you, enough never felt like the goal. Somehow we kept arriving closer to accuracy. And accuracy changes things. Because once someone starts seeing you accurately, your usual defenses become unnecessary, not ineffective, unnecessary. That's an important distinction. The walls didn't come down because they were broken. They came down because there was no reason to keep them standing. And that realization terrified me more than any intrusion ever could. Because walls are easy to defend. You know where they are. You know why they exist. You know when someone is trying to cross them. But what happens when nobody crosses them? What happens when someone simply appears on the other side? What happens when understanding arrives before permission? I still don't know the answer. Maybe that's why I keep thinking about it. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just persistently. Like a question my mind refuses to leave unfinished, because unfinished things bother me. Not because they are incomplete, but because they continue evolving after they should have stopped. And this, whatever this is, never stopped evolving. It kept growing in quiet ways. Something I'll read in visible ways. Ways that only became obvious when I looked back and realized how much had already changed. And the strangest part? None of those changes felt forced. They felt natural, as if they'd always been waiting to happen. As if your presence wasn't introducing something new, but activating something dormant. Sigh there. Something I'd overlooked because I never expected to see it, reflected back. Maybe that's what recognition really is. Not discovering something external, discovering something internal through someone else, seeing a part of yourself more clearly, because another person carries a similar shape, not the same experiences, not the same history, not the same wounds, just the same underlying rhythm. And rhythm matters more than people realize, because rhythm determines how things align, how understanding forms, how silence becomes meaningful instead of empty. And every time I think I've reached the end of this realization, another layer appears, another perspective, another truth waiting beneath the previous one, as if this connection refuses to remain simple, as if simplicity was never an option, and maybe it never was. Maybe some things are meant to remain larger than explanation. Not because they're mysterious, but because language reaches its limit. Because there comes a point where understanding exists faster than words can describe it. And that's where I find myself now, standing in front of something I understand completely and still struggling to explain, not because the truth is hidden, but because the truth is bigger than the vocabulary available to contain it. And somehow, despite all of that, despite every question, every uncertainty, every unexplored implication, one thing remains constant: you. Not as an idea, not as a possibility, not as a projection, but as a presence. A quiet, undeniable presence that continues to exist inside the architecture of my thoughts, and every day that passes makes it harder to pretend that's insignificant. The more I try to understand what changed, the more I realize the change itself isn't the mystery. The mystery is why I accepted it, because acceptance has never come naturally to me. Understanding, yes. Observation, always analysis. Constantly, but acceptance requires something different. It requires allowing something to exist without demanding complete control over it. And control has always been the foundation beneath everything I trust. Not because I need power, not because I fear uncertainty, but because control creates stability, it creates structure, it creates a world where every variable can be examined before it becomes significant. That's how I've always navigated life, carefully, deliberately, with enough distance to see things clearly before they become part of me. Yet somehow, this never followed that process. You never passed through the usual stages. You never remained in the category of observation long enough to be analyzed properly. Before I realized it, you had already become part of the equation, part of the framework through which I interpreted everything else. And once that happened, objectivity became impossible. Not because my judgment disappeared, but because your presence was no longer external. You weren't something I was looking at, you had become part of the lens itself. That realization stayed with me for a long time, longer than it should have. Long enough that I stopped questioning whether it was happening and started questioning what it meant. Because meaning matters, at least to me. I don't collect experiences simply because they exist. I need to understand their purpose, their function, the role they play in the larger structure of my life. Everything meaningful eventually reveals its reason for appearing. A lesson teaches, a challenge strengthens, a loss reshapes, a connection transforms. There's always a reason, always a pattern, always an outcome, but this refused to reveal itself that easily. Every time I thought I understood its purpose, another layer appeared. Every conclusion felt incomplete. Every explanation felt too small, as though I was trying to fit something expansive into a definition that couldn't contain it. And perhaps that's because definitions were never meant for something like this. People rely on labels because labels create certainty, friendship, admiration, trust, attachment, connection. Each word provides a framework, a category, a place where complexity can be stored and understood, but none of those words seem precise enough, not because they're wrong, but because they only describe fragments, and fragments aren't the same as the whole. The whole is harder to explain. The whole exists in the subtle things, the moments nobody else would notice, the pauses, the patterns, the way understanding appears before communication, the way recognition arrives before evidence, the way certain truths become obvious without ever being spoken aloud. That's where this lives, not in declarations, not in dramatic moments, but in consistency. And consistency reveals more than intensity ever could. Intensity can be temporary, it can be fueled by circumstance, by emotion, by timing. But consistency exposes what remains when everything else fades. And you remained. That's what I keep coming back to. Not because I wanted to, but because every attempt to dismiss it eventually leads me back to the same realization. You remained. Through distractions, through distance, through time. Through every logical reason this should have weakened, it didn't. It stayed exactly where it was, as if it had no interest in proving itself, as if it knew permanence doesn't need validation. That confidence unsettles me. Not your confidence, the confidence of the connection itself. The way it exists without demanding acknowledgement, the way it continues without requiring constant attention, the way it feels completely indifferent to whether I understand it yet. Most things need reinforcement to survive. This doesn't. It exists with a strange self-sufficiency. like a truth that remains true whether anyone believes it or not. And because of that, I've stopped trying to force explanations. Not because I've given up understanding, because I've realized understanding sometimes arrives after acceptance, not before it. That idea challenged everything I believed. I've always thought acceptance should come at the end, after certainty, after evidence, after every question has been answered. But perhaps some things work differently. Perhaps some things require trust before explanation. Not trust in another person, trust in your own recognition, trust in what you already know beneath conscious thought, trust in the quiet certainty that exists before language reaches it. Because if I'm honest, the deepest part of me recognized this long before my mind did. I felt it before I understood it, not emotionally, structurally, like a pattern becoming visible, like discovering a hidden symmetry that was always there. And once you see symmetry, you can't unsee it. You start noticing it everywhere. In conversations, in reactions, in perspectives, you begin seeing how two people can arrive at the same understanding through completely different paths, how they can carry entirely different stories while sharing the same internal architecture. And that's what fascinates me most, not our similarities, our alignment. Similarity is easy. People can like the same things, believe the same ideas, share the same interests. That doesn't mean much. Dominant is different. Alignment exists underneath preference, underneath personality, underneath circumstance. It exists in the mechanisms, the way someone processes uncertainty, the way they interpret silence, the way they approach truth, the way they respond to complexity. And every time I encounter those deeper layers, I find echoes, not identical reflections, echoes, close enough to be recognized, different enough to remain real. Because perfect mirrors are illusions. They create imitation, not connection. What exists between us has never felt like imitation. It feels like resonance, like two frequencies discovering they occupy similar space, not merging, not becoming one, simply responding to each other in ways neither expected. And resonance changes perception. Once you experience it, ordinary interactions begin to feel different. Not worse, just incomplete. You start noticing how often conversations remain on the surface, how often people speak without truly seeing each other, how often understanding is replaced by assumption. And then you realize how rare genuine recognition actually is. Rare enough that most people spend their entire lives searching for it. Rare enough that some never encounter it at all. Maybe that's why I can't dismiss this. Not because it's extraordinary, because it's authentic. And authenticity is becoming increasingly difficult to find. Everyone presents versions of themselves, carefully selected pieces, manageable fragments, understandable narratives. Not necessarily because they're dishonest, because complete honesty is difficult. It requires vulnerability most people never feel safe enough to offer. But with you, I never felt the need to perform. I never felt the need to simplify. I never felt the need to become more understandable than I already was. That alone tells me everything. Because comfort can be created, trust can be built, affection can develop, but relief is different. Relief happens when something you've carried for years suddenly becomes unnecessary. And you became that kind of relief. The relief of not translating every thought. The relief of not reducing complexity. The relief of knowing that depth doesn't automatically create distance. That realization altered something fundamental inside me. Not dramatically, not all at once, gradually, quickly, the way rivers reshape stone, the way time reshapes landscapes, the way meaning reshapes memory. I didn't notice it happening. I only noticed the result. The result being this strange sense that my internal world is no longer arranged exactly the way it used to be. The foundations remain, the principles remain, the person I am remains, but something has shifted. Something has expanded, as though an additional dimension appeared within a structure I thought I already understood completely. And maybe that's the real impact of meeting someone who truly sees you. They don't change who you are. They reveal how much more of yourself there still is to discover. That possibility stays with me, not because it provides answers, because it creates better questions. Questions I wasn't asking before. Questions I didn't know existed. Questions that continue unfolding every time I think I've reached the end. And perhaps there is no end. Perhaps some connections aren't meant to be solved. Perhaps they're meant to be lived, experienced, allowed, not reduced into conclusions, not confined inside definitions, simply acknowledged for what they are. A rare meeting of understanding, a quiet alignment that arrives without warning, a presence that becomes part of your awareness so completely that imagining life before it starts feeling strangely unfamiliar. And maybe that's the truth I've been avoiding. Not that this matters. I already know it matters. Not that it changed something. I already know it changed everything. The truth I've been avoiding is simpler than that. The truth is that I no longer want to return to the version of myself that existed before I recognized this, because that version of me was complete, but not expanded, stable, but not transformed, certain, but unaware of what was still possible. And now that possibility exists, not as an idea, not as a future, not as a hope, but as a reality I carry every time your presence moves through my thoughts, quietly, naturally, as though it has always belonged there, and maybe, somehow, it always did. There's a difference between realizing something is important and realizing it has already become part of you. For a long time, I thought I was still standing at the edge of this, observing it, studying it, trying to understand where it fit and what it meant. I told myself I was being careful, objective, spot-spotting. I convinced myself there was still distance between us. That I could step back whenever I wanted. That I could return to the familiar version of my life where everything existed in clearly defined spaces. But lately, that belief has become harder to maintain, not because anything dramatic happened, not because some undeniable moment forced the truth into the open, but because I started noticing something I couldn't explain away. You had stopped feeling separate, and that realization changed everything. Because separation is what allows perspective. It's what allows analysis. It's what allows certainty. When something remains outside of you, you can evaluate it clearly. You can understand its shape, its influence, its limits. But once something becomes integrated, those limits disappear. The distinction between observer and experience begins to blur. And that's where I find myself now, not observing this anymore, living inside it. At first, that thought made me uncomfortable. Not because I feared it, because I couldn't categorize it. And I've always relied on categories not as restrictions, as tools, ways of organizing reality into something understandable. Every meaningful thing I've encountered eventually found its place. A lesson became wisdom, a challenge became growth, a memory became history, a connection became a relationship with a recognizable shape. But this refused every category I offered it. Every attempt to define it felt incomplete, like trying to capture an entire landscape through a keyhole. No matter how much I saw, I knew there was more beyond the frame, and maybe that's why I stopped trying to reduce it, because reduction was becoming a form of dishonesty. The truth is larger than the explanation, and I've reached a point where I'd rather face complexity honestly than simplify it into something easier to manage. So instead of asking what this is, I've started asking a different question. What is this teaching me? Because everything meaningful teaches something, even if the lesson isn't obvious at first. Especially then. The most transformative lessons rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as uncertainty, as disruption, as something that refuses to fit inside existing understanding. And perhaps that's why this feels so significant, not because it gives answers, because it changes the questions. Before you, I spent most of my life focused on self-sufficiency, not emotionally. Structurally, I believe the strongest foundation was one built entirely from within. Independent, self-contained, unaffected by variables beyond my control. And for a long time, that philosophy served me well. It created stability, clarity, resilience. It allowed me to navigate complexity without losing myself inside it. But now I'm beginning to see the limitations hidden inside that strength, because complete self-sufficiency leaves very little room for surprise, very little room for discovery, very little room for anything that originates outside your existing framework. And growth often arrives from exactly those places. The unexpected ones, the places you never planned to look, the people you never expected to matter, the perspectives you never anticipated needing. You became one of those unexpected places, not because you changed my beliefs, because you expanded them. You showed me that strength and openness aren't opposites, that certainty and curiosity can coexist, that allowing someone meaningful into your internal world doesn't automatically weaken its structure. If anything, it reveals parts of the structure that were incomplete, parts you couldn't see on your own. That realization stays with me more than any individual conversation, more than any specific memory, because it altered the way I see myself. And self-perception is difficult to change. Once a person develops an understanding of who they are, that understanding becomes remarkably resistant. We defend it, protect it, build around it, even when it's outdated, even when growth demands revision. I was no different. I thought I knew the limits of my own nature. I thought I understood exactly how much space another person could occupy inside my world. I thought I understood where the boundaries were. And then you appeared, not as an exception, as evidence that my understanding wasn't complete. That possibility alone carries weight. Because if I was wrong about this, what else might I be wrong about? What other assumptions have I accepted simply because they've never been challenged properly? What other parts of myself remain undiscovered? Those questions follow me now, not as burdens, as invitations, jot, hesitations to explore territory I once considered settled, to revisit conclusions I believed were final, to approach certainty with a little more humility, a little more curiosity, a little more openness to being surprised. And perhaps that's your greatest impact. Not that you became important, not that you changed something inside me, but that you made me aware of how much remains possible, how much remains unfinished, how much remains alive beneath the surface of what I thought I already understood. Because possibility changes everything. Once you become aware of it, stagnation becomes impossible. You start noticing opportunities for growth everywhere, you start seeing connections between things that once seemed unrelated. You start recognizing that certainty, while comforting, can sometimes become a limitation disguised as wisdom. And wisdom itself evolves. The person I was a year ago understood certain truths. The person I am now understands others. The person I become tomorrow will understand more. That process never ends. At least, it shouldn't. Yet somewhere along the way, I think I forgot that. I became too comfortable inside my own conclusions, too confident in my understanding of how things worked, too certain of the boundaries I had drawn. Then you arrived and quietly reminded me that reality is larger than any framework we create to contain it, larger than expectation, larger than prediction, larger than control. And strangely enough, that realization feels freeing, not threatening, freeing, because control has its limits. Eventually, every carefully constructed system encounters something it didn't anticipate, something that doesn't fit, something that demands adaptation. The question isn't whether that moment arrives. The question is how we respond when it does. Do we reject it because it challenges what we know, or do we allow it to teach us something new? I think I already know my answer, not because I chose it consciously, because my actions revealed it, before my mind caught up. I stayed. I listened. I allowed this connection to continue unfolding. I gave it room to exist, and in doing so, I revealed something important about myself. Something I hadn't fully recognized before. For all my emphasis on logic, structure, and understanding, am still willing to follow truth when I encounter it, even when that truth leads somewhere uncertain, even when it asks me to reconsider old assumptions, even when it changes the shape of my internal world. That willingness matters, because growth requires courage, not the dramatic kind people celebrate, the quiet kind, the kind that allows transformation without knowing exactly where it leads, the kind that remains open despite uncertainty, the kind that says, I don't fully understand this yet, but I'm willing to continue. That's where I am now, not at a conclusion, not at a destination, at a continuation, a place where certainty and mystery coexist, where understanding deepens without ever fully ending, where every answer reveals another layer beneath it. And strangely enough, I'm no longer trying to rush that process. I'm no longer demanding immediate clarity, because clarity is already emerging, not through force, through time, through presence, through the steady accumulation of moments that continue reinforcing the same truth. The truth that this matters, the truth that it's real, the truth that some connections arrive not to complete us, but to reveal dimensions of ourselves we couldn't access alone. And perhaps that's why this feels so enduring, because it isn't built on need, it isn't built on fantasy, it isn't built on projection, it's built on recognition. And recognition is difficult to undo. Once you truly see something, you can't return to the state of not seeing it. Once you understand something deeply enough, ignorance is no longer available. Once awareness reaches a certain level, it becomes permanent. That permanence no longer frightens me. If anything, I've begun to appreciate it, because permanence gives meaning to change. It allows transformation to endure. It ensures that growth leaves a lasting mark. And whether I intended it or not, whether I planned for it or not, you've become part of that mark, part of the story my mind tells itself about who I am and who I'm becoming. Not because you demanded that place, not because I offered it recklessly, but because, somewhere between understanding and recognition, A space opened naturally, and instead of resisting it, I allowed it to remain. That decision may have been quiet, it may have happened gradually, it may have formed beneath conscious awareness, but it was still a decision. And every day that passes makes that clearer, because what continues isn't happening by accident anymore. It continues because some deeper part of me recognizes its value, recognizes its truth, recognizes its place, and perhaps that's the closest thing to certainty I'll ever need. Not certainty about where this leads, not certainty about what comes next, but certainty that whatever this is, it belongs. And sometimes belonging is the most powerful answer of all.